Alright, controversial opinion time, but character design is good and fun. But there's a point of diminishing returns when drawing characters, illustrating characters, posing characters. It's easy for them to get lost in a blank void of contextlessness. I'm saying that it's kind of hard for people to care about your characters if they're just on a white blank background. If you can ground your character's story with their own world, props, background characters, it helps people understand and care about what's going on. And maybe it can pull you out of the trap of simply thinking about your character's story and not doing anything about it. I don't know if anyone's ever been in that spot. If you're used to character drawing, the idea of landscapes and buildings, backgrounds, and props could be a little intimidating. I'm going to walk you through an example set of work that I've done to flesh out the world of Biko and his crew, and the thought process for developing all of the stuff that's not the main characters. So I've been carrying you through the process of designing this cast of characters and their story, and I really appreciate that there's interest from you in what's going on with them. And before I can start committing to fleshing out these characters' world, it does help to have some intention in what you're doing. If you look around the world and through history, different peoples and their cultures are affected by where they live and what conditions they're in, and what resources they have access to. People that live near the ocean do a lot of fishing. People that live in the cold are bundled up and build to retain heat. Sometimes the more developed or advanced a civilization is, the more they sort of cut themselves off from the natural world. Thinking about the world your characters are a part of should cause you to think about and make design decisions that reinforce that. So for Biko, Quilver, Glangor, and Aetius, I've talked before about them being a traveling party, but here's that lore drop that I've kind of been holding out on. These characters live on a small continent that is plagued by frequent storms. Storms that take the shape of giant creatures and almost seem to act with a mind of their own. This continent is surrounded by dead water on all sides, and while the storms rage on in the majority of this island, they never quite reach the edge, which is hedged on all sides by mountains. The people of this world take refuge in the mountains, but in order to gain resources to try and reclaim their land, the people hire adventurous and brave mercenaries who try to take down the storms. These traveling groups are called Stormfellers. Designing the world of Stormfellers feels daunting at first because I'm not used to drawing land masses. And while the two concept illustrations I'm showing you now are still fairly rough, I tried to follow the same thought process that I would with characters, using broad, overarching shapes, gesture, and clear ideas to inform the design. Because this land is so unique, defining it with these mountains, a mysterious center, and various biomes was sort of the easy part. Probably the more difficult aspect was trying to establish the scale of this place. It requires a lot of small details that really should be too small to recognize. The second that you see a tree in this illustration, for example, unless it's somehow a gigantic tree, you've immediately set the scale of this place against, say, the mountains. While I am a fan of using layers that have blending modes, I only do that at first with this piece. I found it was best when I continuously painted over with new values, new color, and new contrast. I really tried to push the vibrancy of this piece because in the end, it's still very brightly colored, stylized characters that are inhabiting this world, not a hyper-realistic or high fantasy world. This absolutely isn't my forte, but I'm pretty pleased with the general vibe with this piece. I think the key with this is to know when to make really broad strokes and when to get really noodly with the details. I then took this final concept and flattened the color range a bit and added some detail that changed the lighting conditions. I turned this relatively peaceful looking island into a raging storm center, with much starker lighting, add and color dodge layers for the lightning, and motion blur on the swirling clouds. It made quick work of any remaining piece in the image. Having the world established now makes it possible to think about the people in it and the way that they live. What resources do they have access to? Well, what I realized is that not only are they precariously scattered in the mountains, but the building materials that they have access to are affected by the rules of this world. They probably don't have access to tons of sturdy trees for logging because trees are likely uprooted by storms and don't often age past saplings. Instead of timber, I tried to design their buildings with wood fiber, grass, saplings, and bamboo. Even though they are sort of surrounded by stone, I felt like they likely wouldn't tap into the resource much because of the idea or even superstition that these mountains are their source of shelter, and mining sort of wears down that strength. So either out of respect or fear, they aren't really using stones unless they're loose and free. For inspiration, I looked at a lot of buildings from areas like the African grasslands and island nations like Micronesia. I think pushing peoples that would usually thrive in the grass or near the water up into the mountains presents unique challenges to them and makes for interesting designs. I also looked at the buildings of people in Europe and Central America that are built either into the side of cliffs or right into the stone. I want the look of these villages to be precarious and stacked on top of each other in a way. Drawing these buildings was not very different from character drawing. There's still an amount of gesture with simple shapes at play here. There are a lot of different ideas here because this is all concepting and iteration. There's a few common elements though, which were the flags and windsocks. I thought the people would be obsessed with knowing the way that the wind is blowing. I also spent a little time working on designs for background characters in this world. For me, that almost always means shopkeepers. This first character is a bit of a callback to an old design of mine that had some cool elements but was really poorly structured. The Biko characters so far have been so fun because there's an element of animals, of tribal aesthetics, of sort of folksy aesthetics too, and of very goofy looking elements, abstractions that are almost Jim Henson inspired. But with background or secondary characters like this, there is such thing as sort of over-designing or taking attention away from the important characters, so it's a bit of a balance. This second character I wanted to look almost like they could be an adventurer themselves, just not as interesting or dynamic. I think it kind of brings up the average for these peoples. If they're kind of gruff and ready to rumble, they aren't necessarily helpless and cowering, they're resilient in general. Now that I have all of the elements that I've built through this video, here I have just a quick rough sketch and some values of what I imagine all of these pieces coming together to look like, with Biko approaching this area in the bottom area there. There are a lot more things that I'd like to do with these people, for example, exploring the culture and designs and decorations they may have, and of course as far as the project is concerned, there's a ton of things like props, other areas, more characters, and the storms themselves. I hope this work has given you some thoughts on designing the world and environment around your characters. I think it's tragic to put all kinds of thought into who your character is and then quickly throw together some line art cube houses in the background, because it can really break our illusion and investment into the characters and story you're trying to tell. If you're daunted by doing this kind of work, probably the best step is to gather references and do studies. So much of our character artwork is filtered, a buildup of things that we've observed and practiced, and environment art is kind of its own bicycle to learn. Now on May 18th of this year, I did the first concept for a character called Port. Port is supposed to be a member of a traveling group, kind of like you'd see in an RPG or a video game, where there's 4 or so characters. This is a story about a character that's almost as old as this channel. Thank you for watching, and have fun creating.